Welcome to Cloud Study Jam, on-air live webinars from Google Cloud. This week, you're watching a hands-on lab session for our infrastructure-focused Cloud Study Jam. You can ask questions anytime by submitting them in the box below this screen. We have Googlers on standby to answer them. Let's get started. Hello, welcome to Week 3, Infrastructure, Hands-on Lab Session 2. This is a Cloud Study Jam, where we walk you through no-cost training on Google Cloud. This session is on the infrastructure track, and today I'm going to walk through an infrastructure challenge lab. I'm also going to drop a few pro tips from our advanced lab creators for improving your scores. These are proven tips to help you max out your scores in our weekly Cloud Hero hands-on lab games. I'll tell you how to join this week's game a little later. I'm Mike Trudy. I'm the Technical Curriculum Lead for Infrastructure in Google Cloud Learning, and I'm Google Cloud Professionally Certified, or Certifiable, a few times. In this session, first, I'm going to introduce you to our baseline infrastructure quests, which you can use to explore our cloud infrastructure tools hands-on. Then I'm going to show you how to access our hands-on labs, so you can try one yourself, or follow along if you like. And finally, I'm going to walk you through one of our infrastructure challenge labs. Now, challenge labs are a little different than regular hands-on labs. In a regular lab, we describe features and then walk you through step by step to try out what you learned. With a challenge lab, you get assigned a series of end goals and an allocated time to meet the goals. There's no step-by-step instructions. A challenge lab is the last lab in a quest, and you need to use what you learned in the other labs to complete the tasks. Challenge labs aren't easy. To score 100%, you must complete all tasks within the allotted time period. Our lab is capped at 60 minutes. Did you know that Google Cloud runs on the same global infrastructure that powers YouTube, Gmail, and other Google products used by billions of people around the world? To get a foundational knowledge of Google Cloud, you should complete Quick Lab's infrastructure quests, which walk you through hands-on practice with real Google Cloud resources and tools. There are 3 quests I like to start. The first one is the Getting Started Create and Manage Cloud Resources quest. In this quest, we introduce Cloud Shell, VPC Networks, Compute Engine, and Kubernetes Engine. Second, do the Perform Foundational Infrastructure tasks in Google Cloud Quest. This includes labs for storage, IAM, monitoring, Cloud Functions, and PubSub. Third, do the Setup and Configure a Cloud Environment in Google Cloud Quest. The Challenge Lab walkthrough that I'm going to do is from this quest. Real quick, I'm going to review the labs in this quest. The topics covered in the first 6 labs are going to be needed to complete the challenge lab. Lab 1 is Cloud IAM Quick Start, introducing you to identity and access management in Google Cloud. In Lab 2, Introduction to SQL for BigQuery and Cloud SQL, you learn some SQL and run queries in BigQuery and Cloud SQL. Lab 3 is about creating multiple VPC networks and using VM instances within them. Lab 4, Cloud Monitoring Quick Start, helps you start monitoring your resources for specific events. In Lab 5, you launch a service using Deployment Manager, full production, and you do some more monitoring with the service. And in Lab 6, you scale and manage containers by managing deployments using Kubernetes Engine. Finally, Lab 7 is the Challenge Lab, set up and configure a cloud environment in Google Cloud. And we'll get to that soon. Let's get into Quick Labs. There are a couple of ways you can get access to the lab we'll be demoing today. Now, if you're following along live with us, in Week 3, as part of Google Cloud Next On Air 20, you can hop into this week's Cloud Hero gamified experience. The game is a week-long contest of curated labs relevant to this week's theme with prizes. The lab I'm going through today is included in this week's challenge. There's a link to get started in the description of this video. The link takes you to a page with all of the Cloud Hero games for next on air. Find Week 3 Infrastructure and click Join. If you need to stop this for a second, don't worry. You can pause and keep watching later. Or if you want to focus on watching me or ask questions in the Q&A, don't feel like you need to log into Quick Labs just yet. Once you join the game, you'll see a screen like this, which says Week 3 in the title. If you scroll down, you'll see the Cloud Engineering Labs, and this is the quest I showed you earlier. I'm going to walk through the last lab, the Challenge Lab. We announced recently that when you complete one of these special quests with a Challenge Lab, you earn a Google Cloud Skill Badge. Google Cloud Skill Badges are a recognition you can earn when you complete Quick Labs quests with a Challenge Lab. You develop your skills, and you can share your skill badge on your social profiles or resume. Check out cloud.google.com/training/badges for more details on that. Now let's hop over to the Challenge Lab. And the way we get this started is we click Start Lab. Now this lab takes about 2 minutes to do some behind the scenes setup. So while it's working, let's just scroll down a little bit and look at the scenario that we've got laid out here. So we've got some topics covered, some setup, but this challenge scenario here, this is the meat of what we have to do in this challenge lab. This is a scenario with 9 tasks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we have some company standards here. Our company standards require that we create all resources in the US East 1 region and the US East 1B zone, unless otherwise directed. We're going to use the project VPC networks that are created by the lab setup. And then if we have to name any resources or resources are already named, they're going to use a team resource convention with a hyphen. And then the last part is if we have to create any machines, we're going to default to N1 standard 1 machines, unless we're otherwise directed in the task. And our challenge is sort of to set up an entire environment. And this is a pretty good architecture diagram. And I'm going to go ahead. What I normally do when I get an architecture diagram like this is I pop it into a new tab, and it's easier to see. But first, what we're going to do now that the lab is ready to go, we can go ahead and get started with the lab. So to do that, I'm in an incognito window, actually. You can see to the top right here. And the easiest thing to do is to log into Quick Labs in an incognito window. And then when you click Open Google Console, it should take me right where I need to go to get the project started. So I'm going to copy my username here to log into the console. And this is a Quick Labs user ID and password logging into Google Cloud. So I don't have to enter any billing information or personal information of any kind. I'm going to accept the student user account terms. I'm going to confirm the default recovery setup. Okay, this is the Google Cloud Console. I'm going to click Agree and agree and continue to terms of service. And notice that my project is already set up here in this top window. It's the same project that Quick Labs assigned me here in this project ID box. So I'm in Cloud Console, and I'm going to go ahead and close out the menu there. So I'm actually ready to go here. So the other thing that I kind of do when I do these projects is I go ahead and edit this architecture drawing. I try to put my own notes on it. So what I do is I open up Google Drive and I click New, a new drawing. And then I just give it some title. and I copy this image and I paste it into here. And I try to make notes on my architecture diagram as I'm building the lab. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so if I go back to the lab here and I look through these, in summary, based on this architecture diagram here, our goal is to get this WordPress application running, which means I need a Kubernetes cluster and a VPC and a database, and in this case, a Bastion host that I use. So we've got some work to do to kind of step through all these tasks to get this WordPress application running in our dev environment. If I skip down here to task 1 and I kind of read through these instructions, I've got to create a VPC called dev VPC, which if you scroll up here on the architecture diagram, it's this big blue box with some subnets. The 2 purple boxes are the subnets. So I don't create networks all that often. And when I do, I usually use the Cloud Console because it walks me through the steps real nicely. So Griffin Dev WP. So if I kind of hop over here, I can pick VPC network, create VPC network. If I follow the instructions there, the name of the network is Griffin Dev VPC. I'm going to leave custom subnet creation mode here, and I got to create 2 subnets. The first one is Griffin Dev WP. We have to use region US East 1. And then we've got an IP range of 192.168.16.0, and that's a /20. And then we click done there. And then I think I've got to create a second subnet. So I'm going to say add subnet. This is for our management subnet. So I'm going to say Griffin Dev Management. And that's US East 1 also. And that's 192.168.32.0/20. And we're going to leave default dynamic routing mode, no server policy, no private DNS happening here. And we're going to click create. Okay, so that's going to take about 30 seconds. So we used Griffin Dev WP, an IP address block for each of these. And while we're waiting, what we could do, which I like to do, is hop over to the architecture diagram and kind of annotate my subnets. So 192.168.16.0 was dev WP. And then dev management is 192.168.32.0. And that's a /20. And that's a /20. All right, so we've updated our diagram. There's our VPC network with our 2 subnets. Let's go back over here and click check progress to see, task 1 complete. Okay, so one thing to note is we can click on score here. And if we get stuck on a step, you can actually click run step, and it'll give you a hint. In this case, it says we completed the assessment. So this is a little trick. A lot of people don't know it. But as you go through the steps, you might get some small hints by coming in here and clicking this if you're stuck on a step. The other thing that I should tell you is if you're completing this challenge lab as part of a game, your game score is based partly on your completion time. So finishing faster gets you a better score. If you want to improve your score on a challenge lab in a game, you can restart the lab and do it again faster. You can do this up to 5 times. Okay, so we're on to task 2. So for task 2, we got to copy some files from a bucket. And then we're going to run a deployment. Then we need to run a deployment manager script. Okay, so let's head over here. Let's open up Cloud Console by clicking Activate Cloud Shell. I'm going to click Continue. It takes just a couple seconds to open up Cloud Shell. My personal setup in Terminal is to change the font to monospace and the text size to medium. I can read it a lot better there. Okay, so we're going to copy these files. Now, we did use GSUtil in the Cloud IAM Quick Start Lab, so I remember how to use GSUtil to copy files from a Cloud bucket. And there's another piece I want to show you here before I get to GSUtil, which is I sometimes forget the details of commands like gcloud and GSUtil. So I'm starting to use this gcloud interactive mode, but it's only in beta right now. So sometimes it does have problems. But I just thought I'd try that for a minute. And once this loads, you're going to see function key prompts along the bottom of my shell screen, along with little reminders of my project and user. As well as some possible help text. And the nice thing about this gcloud interactive mode is it helps me with my commands. So when I start to do task 2, they want me to copy some files. I'm going to use GSUtil, and you can see that it's auto-completing for me. If I hit tab, it kind of helps me. So then I hit space, and it's giving me the GSUtil commands that are options. So this is really nice. So I'm going to do a copy, and I want to do all the files. So I do -R, and then I'm going to grab the bucket that we had there. And I'm just going to copy that folder into my root folder. Okay, so now I can go look at that DM folder, and I've got one YAML and one Jinja file. And I know that in Deployment Manager, these are the template files that are used to create infrastructure resources. So if you didn't know, Cloud Shell has a built-in editor, and it's changed a bit recently, and I think it's pretty awesome. So I click Open Editor, and it's going to switch my view over to the editor view. And then the files that we copied are in this DM folder. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with the YAML file. And I already know that the region here is wrong, so I'm going to fix the region. And this little circle at the top tells me when it's saving. So when I change it, the circle tells me it's saving. Now it's saved. So then I can click over on the Jinja file, and I can see the details here are that it's going to create a prod VPC and then some subnets in prod for us. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste these IP ranges into our architecture diagram. So this is prod WP subnet. If I come over here, there's the prod WP subnet. So if I just kind of paste that guy. And then this guy is a 64. Okay, so we're creating some documentation here as we build our project. Okay, that looks good. So let's go back to the terminal. And now we're going to use gcloud interactive to deploy that script. So we do gcloud, and there's deployment manager. That's pretty nice. And we need a deployment, and we're going to create. And I need to deploy. So it's prompting me for the next thing that I need to type. So I need a name. So I want to use Griffin Prod as my name, and then I'm going to point it at that config file that we just edited. And I'm going to go ahead and kick that off. And what we expect that to do is we have this Griffin Dev VPC here, and we expect that guy to create the prod VPC. So we can kind of watch up here on the refresh, see if something happens there. So we're trying to create the prod VPC and the two prod subnets, prod WP and prod management. So deployment manager is working. We can refresh here to see, oh, there we go. The UI's already got it. So we've got our prod VPC and our two subnets, and we'll just let deployment manager finish here. And we've got our three resources. If I hop back to the lab and I check my progress, the lab says we're good. Okay, we're on to task 3. For task 3, they want us to create a bastion host. And a bastion host is usually a VM that has an external IP address that helps you get at VMs that don't have IP addresses. And I know there's some pretty good explanations on bastion hosts in the Google Cloud docs. But if I look at the architecture diagram here, this is my bastion host right here. And it's actually connected across two VPCs, which means it's using Google's multi-NIC feature, where a VM can have two network interfaces at the same time. And this is actually a task I remember from the multiple VPC networks lab that we did. So in that lab, we used Cloud Console because creating these VMs with multiple network interfaces is a little complicated, and Cloud Console makes it a little easier for us. So I'm going to switch over to Cloud Console, and I'm going to do Compute Engine. And I'm going to do create in VM instances. And this is the new VM instance template workflow. And I really like this. This helps me to create instances a little easier than it used to be. So I'm going to use a name. I'm going to call it VM Bastion. And then US East 1 looks good. East 1B looks good. Remember, they said our project company policy was N1 standard 1s. This looks pretty good. Let's take a look at our networking setup here. I have to open up this little box here. I'm going to go over to networking. I'm going to click this. So it says there's our dev VPC. I'm going to go ahead and work on that a little bit. Now, there's a little bit of a trap here that I guess I have to explain, which is that we're going to create this VM, and we want to be able to SSH into it. That was one of the instructions from the lab, is when we create our Bastion host, it says make sure you can SSH into the host. And by default, when you create a custom VPC, it doesn't have firewall rules that allow SSH access. So we need a firewall rule that allows TCP port 22 traffic. And I know that this particular lab looks for firewall rules on both of the VPCs. So we're going to create two firewall rules. So for the primary NIC on this VM, I'm going to choose the prod VPC. And the subnet needs to be prod management. That's right. We're going to allow an external IP here. So that all looks pretty good. Now what we have to do is we have to add a second network interface. And that guy should be Griffin. That guy should be Griffin Dev VPC and Dev Management. That looks good. That looks good. And we can say done. Okay. The other thing we can do here from Cloud Console is we can learn. And so this is the equivalent command line of what we just did in that console. And that's quite a bit to remember. So this is a good reason why sometimes Cloud Console is easier. But I will tell you, in terms of Cloud Hero game tips, remember what I said earlier about retaking a lab to improve your completion speed? Here's another big tip. If you save these command lines, you can enter them way faster than walking through the Cloud Console UI. And if you're a really serious player, you can take these command lines and create a small script from your saved commands. And that's really a pro tip for a speed run if you're trying to compete and win that Cloud Hero game. Okay, so we can close this and click Create to create our VM. Google's got some new tutorials to help you if you're new to working with VMs. I'm okay for that. So we created our VM. I wanted to just hop over here. We did name the VM Bastion, and so I copied it. I'm just going to move it over to my drawing, update my drawing. Okay. There we go. So now, because we custom created this VPC, we're going to need those firewall rules. So now I've got to create those guys. So if I browse to firewall, and I create a firewall rule, I need two of them, one for each VPC. So let's call this one allow prod SSH. I'm going to do, I like to ping, so I'm going to add ICMP as well. This one's going to be the prod VPC because I said prod. I'm going to allow ingress. I'm going to do, this is just a lab, so I'm going to do all instances on the network. I don't know what my Cloud Shell IP address is, so I'm going to allow all IPs. And then I need TCP 22 and ICMP. So let's create that firewall rule. Now while that's happening, I can create the second firewall rule. Okay, guys, allow dev SSH and ICMP. That's the dev network. We're going to allow all instances. We're going to do all IPs just so we can get into that bastion host. We're back to SSH, and that'll let us do pings. Okay, so this should be our two firewall rules. So let's give that a second and see how long it takes to create those guys. Okay, now if I head back over to Compute Engine, I got to check that I can actually get into that SSH. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but I was able to do the SSH. I logged in, and I can do like a curl command to ifconfig.io/IP. I can see the IP address of that bastion host. That looks great. So I'm going to exit that now, and I'm back into here. This all looks really good. I can even grab the external IP and ping it 34.75.128.212. You can see that up here, external IP, and that responds. So that VM is working. That looks really good. Let's see if the lab notices that we completed that task 3, and we did. All right, we're on to task 4. So task 4, we have to create and configure a Cloud SQL instance. So we're going to do a MySQL Cloud SQL instance called Griffin Dev DB. And then once we create that instance, we're going to create a database. So let's see, what do we have to do for that? So for that, we have to head over in the Cloud Console to SQL instances. We're going to say create an instance. We're going to do a MySQL instance. We're going to name our instance Griffin Dev DB. That's what it said in the architecture diagram. I've got to set a root password. I'm going to change the location like we said earlier to US East 1 and 1B. And that's it. Now, I can show config options here and see things like connectivity, machine type, and storage. I'm not going to change any of that stuff, but it's good to know that I have all these options when I'm setting up my instance. And I'm going to click Create. Okay, now creating a MySQL instance is going to take a little while. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop down to task 5 here and get started on that, which is because I know creating a cluster takes a little while too. So I've kicked off the MySQL instance. Now I'm going to kick off creating a cluster, and then we'll go back to task 4. So for task 5, I have to create a 2-node cluster. I'm using a different machine size. I'm using these N1 standard 4s, but I'm still in the same region and zone that I'm normally in. So let's see, that means it's going to be a zonal cluster, since by default regional clusters spread their masters and nodes across 3 zones of a region. And if I look back at the architecture diagram here for the cluster, I can see that the cluster we're going to create here is in the Griffin Dev subnet in the Griffin Dev VPC. So it's going to be a dev cluster here. Okay, so I guess the easiest way to do this is, by the way, this is something that we did in the managing deployments using Kubernetes Engine lab. And we did use gcloud in that lab, but I'm going to go ahead and use our Cloud Console for this. So I'm going to head back over here to, this time I'm going to go to Kubernetes clusters. I'm going to create a cluster. And notice this is our new cluster creation experience. So we have in Cloud Console, we have a new create a VM instance experience. We have a new cluster creation experience, and lots of other UI is getting a lot easier to use. This is pretty nice. It's chunked it into pieces. So for cluster basics, we're just going to set our cluster name, which we like. Griffin Dev was the name that I think we were supposed to use. By default, the zonal is good. We want US East 1B. We're going to leave the master at a static version. We're going to check out our node pools. And the instructions told us to make it a 2-node cluster, so I'm going to swap that to 2. And then I'm going to leave the rest of the defaults here. I'm going to go ahead and check out the nodes. And I see here that I've got N1 standard 1, but we're supposed to be doing an N1 standard 4. So I'm going to switch that to a 4 vCPU machine instance for nodes. So that's our default pool changes. We can look through these other options. Cluster automation, I'm going to leave that stuff alone for now. If I look at cluster networking, I'm going to leave this as a public cluster, but I think private clusters are super interesting. For network, I'm going to make it, remember we said it was in the dev VPC. The subnet's going to be the dev WP subnet. We're going to leave this VPC native traffic routing with alias IPs because that's super efficient. What else? I'm going to leave the address ranges. I'm not enabling intranode visibility. Okay, we can look at security, metadata, features, but I'm just going to leave those as defaults. I'm going to go back and check out my command line again. Wow, okay, so there's a lot going on here. Again, these are, you can copy these for your speedy game scripts if you want to do that, but I'm not going to do that today. And I'm just going to click create here on that cluster. So that's going to take a couple minutes. And while that's happening, we can head back over to task 4 and see how our SQL instance is going. Okay, I think it's just about done. So what we're going to do, according to task 4, is once we have the instance called Griffin Dev DB, we're going to connect to it and we're going to run a command to prepare WordPress. And it's going to create a database called WordPress. And we're going to actually create a user called WP user with a password right here in the database. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this script because I know I'm going to use it later. And I'm going to head back over here. Okay, green, and my database looks pretty good. The first thing I got to do here is I've got to connect to my SQL instance. So we're going to use a gcloud command. And we can do SQL. There is a connect. And we have to name our instance, devdb. And we're going to supply the user that we're going to use. So the first time you run this, it takes a couple of, maybe half a minute, because it's going to go ahead and whitelist the IP address of Cloud Shell so that it has appropriate access to your SQL instance. And we'll give it a sec. So we now have a Cloud SQL instance. And later on, we're going to have to take a note of this instance connection name. This is a fully qualified instance connection name that we're going to need because our WordPress app is going to need to have access to this database. And we're going to have to tell the WordPress app how to get access to this database. Okay, it needs my root password. So I'm going to type that. And there we are, we're in. Okay, and now I'm gonna paste that command that we had before, and now we have our database and our user. That looks pretty good. So I think I can exit and I can check my progress on task 4. And it's verifying that I created that instance in that database. Excellent. Okay, so now we got to go back to our creating the Kubernetes cluster task, task 5. So we're going to come back over here. And our cluster is probably still kind of humming along here. A couple more seconds, probably it'll be ready to go. For fun, I can come back here and check my progress and see if it, oh, it already found the cluster resource. So we can kind of head on to task 6 while it's finishing up the UI. Okay, so we're going to have to use this cluster now that we created it. So we're going to use Cloud Shell and copy some files from another bucket. And these are going to be our manifests for our WordPress application. The WordPress server needs to access the MySQL database using that username and password that we created. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set up some secrets in the cluster so that WordPress can get access to the database. And then we're also going to have a key for a service account that was already set up. And WordPress also needs to store some files, so we're going to have to create a volume. So, okay, oh, there's our cluster. We're ready to go. Let's see. I know that in order for me to work with a cluster, I guess the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy those files. So I'm going to make sure I'm in home. And I'm going to go back to GSUtil. And I'm going to copy those WordPress manifests from the bucket that the lab tells me to get them. Okay, and there's 3 YAML files here. Great. So let's see, we're going to need to add secrets, create a volume for WordPress, and there's a deployment config there for us to do that. So if I open the editor and I click at these WP, and there's actually this M YAML file. And in here, I need to replace a couple values. So let's see, the username that we want to use is WP user. And there's a password that we set earlier. So I think that's it for this guy. It saves by itself. I'm going to go back to the terminal. Now I need to access that cluster. So I'm going to click connect here. And I'm going to run something in Cloud Shell. And it's going to run this gcloud container clusters command, which is going to populate credentials in my Cloud Shell instance so that I can talk to that cluster. And now I need to get that key file created, which I'm just going to copy the instructions from here and paste them in there. And what we're doing here is we're creating a key from an existing service account, and then we're going to download that key file so that we can use it. And so now what we need to do is set up that environment with WordPress by applying the file we edited. So, okay, there's our interactive command being an alpha beta product. So let's close the terminal. Let's open again. Let's go back. Let's try that again without the interactive command. So we'll do q total apply -f wp env. Okay, so we've got both the volume claim and the secret that we said we needed using this kubectl apply command. And I think that's it for task 6. So we can go ahead and see if we made it all the way through. Uh-oh. Let's see. Is there something here that needs to get... Okay, just a timing problem. So there we go. We've got our Kubernetes cluster prepared. We're on to task 7, create a WordPress deployment. Now we have a MySQL database. We've set up secrets in a volume. We can create the deployment using the WP deployment YAML. We've got to edit the file to replace the SQL instance and the instance connection name. And then we want to create a service. So we're going to create both a WordPress deployment and a WordPress service using 2 different YAML files. And the service is going to create a load balancer, which gives us access to our WordPress application. And then we'll actually be able to load up the application and see that it runs. So we've got to basically deploy the service deployment, the service, and then check that we can access the app running. Okay, so let's see, what are we going to do for that? We're going to go back to the Cloud Shell editor. Before we were working on M, this time we're going to work on this deployment. This DB host here needs to change to Griffin dev DB. This DB user needs to change to WP user. This DB password needs to change. And then we need that SQL instance connection name. So I've got to go find that. It's right there. And I got to copy the whole thing. And it goes right here. Okay, and that's saved. So now let's go back to Open Terminal. We're in the right place, I think. So we're going to do this deployment. So we're going to do kubectl apply the deployment YAML. And it says, now to see what's happening there, we cut back over to Kubernetes engine. And there's our cluster, but now we want to see if we created a workload. And there's our workload getting started up. Sometimes it takes a little bit for the workload to start. There we go. We're green. Okay. And now we want to deploy the service, which will create a load balancer. So this will take a little while, probably. Okay. And from services and ingress, we're going to wait for that guy to get started. So what did we just do? So to go back to the architecture diagram, we're in our WordPress pod. We've created a WordPress application deployment, which communicates through a Cloud SQL proxy to our Cloud SQL database, which we populated with a database and a user. And now our service, our Kubernetes service, is going to create a cloud load balancer with an external IP address so that we can access the application. So we're just looking for that external IP address now. So let's kind of take a look here and see if we can see. Oh, there's our IP address, and we can go ahead and see that it's open. There we go. We got an IP address. So I'm going to copy that. So we've got a WordPress app running. That's awesome. All right. I think we can check our progress now on task 7. There we go. So for task 8, they want us to create an uptime check to show that we can do some monitoring on this WordPress development site. So we know that we talked about monitoring and uptime checks in the Cloud Monitoring Quick Start Lab. So it's not that hard to do this, but it does take a little time. So we're going to click back over on the Cloud Console and open up the monitoring pages. And monitoring is going to take just a minute while it builds our workspace. So I'm going to go ahead back to my architecture diagram. And I remember I saved that IP address, and I like to keep those notes handy in case I'm going to need them. So I'm going to move that IP address right here where I can see it. Okay. And setting an uptime check's not really that tricky. You just got to kind of know what your host name is, and we're going to use the IP address for that. And then you've also got a path that the uptime check's going to use, and we're just going to use this default page here. Now, we do have a new cloud monitoring Cloud Console workflow, so I'm hoping I get to use the new workflow to set up our uptime check. Let's see. So here I am in monitoring. I'm going to do uptime checks. And I'm going to do create an uptime check here. Oh, let's see. Okay, so this is the old style UI. So sometimes I get the new style, but at this time I've got the old style UI, which is fine. Okay, so the title we're going to use is Griffin Uptime Check. It's going to be an HTTP type of check. We're going to use a resource type of URL. We had that host name. We're going to use, you can use an IP address as your host name. So I'm just going to use this IP address as my host name. And then I'm going to grab that path off of WordPress here. So I'm just going to grab a path for the uptime check to hit. I'm okay with it checking every minute. I'm okay with all this, so I'm going to say save. Uptime check created. I'm not going to worry about an alert policy for now. Okay, so I should have an uptime check ready to go. I can do check my progress. There we go. All right, now we're on to task 9. So for task 9, they want us to add access for an additional engineer starting. We're going to grant them project editor role, and it'll be the second user account. Okay, I know how to do that. So this is an IAM and admin task. And I think this is from the Cloud IAM Quick Start Lab. So I grab this second user right here, and I go to Cloud Console IAM, and I'm just going to add a user. I'm going to enter that email that I grabbed. And then I have to select a role, which for simplicity, we're going to do project editor. I think most projects are moving away from these project level roles in favor of more fine-grained roles that are task specific, like App Engine admin or BigQuery admin, BigQuery user, storage object creator, stuff like that. But for this lab, we're just going to do project editor. We'll say save. So now I have a second user who should be able to access all of our project resources. Let's check our progress here and see. Check. Okay, so let's just test this for fun though. So if I come back over here to our project, I should be able to sign in as that user and still access things. So let's try that. Let's create a new console. And I'm still logged in as that user there, so I got to sign out. Okay, so I'm going to grab this user here. I'm going to sign out. I'm going to sign in with another account. I'm going to do the second user. I need that password. Same old set of steps. I've got to accept terms and conditions. But now I'm a different user, and I would only be able to access resources in this project if I had some permissions. So let's see if I was able to do that correctly. Pick the project. And like, let's try, for example, there should be that compute engine. We can see that guy. Oh, there they are. We've got the Bastion host and then the cluster nodes. If we head over to Kubernetes engine, we can see our cluster, our workloads, and our service. We can still hit that IP address for the WordPress app. Everything looks pretty good. Okay, so we're done. We completed the lab, which means we should be eligible for a challenge for one of our skill badges. Because this is a challenge lab, we can now earn a credential. And if I look back at the architecture diagram that we kind of worked on, oh, I can't have access to it anymore, so I'll get to the one in the lab here. We can kind of recap what we did. The recap is, here we are. So we created a VPC with some subnets. We actually created one manually and one with a script. We created a VM instance here. We created a Cloud SQL instance with a database. We created a 2-node cluster. We deployed a WordPress app. We created some uptime monitoring checks right there. And then we allowed a second user access to the editor as an editor of my dev environment. Pretty awesome. Okay, so now let's go back to the slides. Oh, click End Lab. Now we can go back to the slides. That's it for the demo. I hope that was helpful for you to walk through an infrastructure challenge lab. Thanks for joining me. Check out the other sessions this week in Google Cloud Next 20 on air. And we're running more Cloud Hero games for the next 6 weeks. Next week, we'll be focusing on security. See you next time.